Bearers of the word, hear our prayer. False angels walk in our midst, casting your image, but bringing none of your mercy. They call themselves the 13th Legion, the warrior kings of Ultramar, and have spoken only threats of bloodshed and sorrow since they darkened the skies a week before. Their warriors have walked the streets of Monarchia, forcing the people to abandon the city. Those who resisted were butchered. Fate willing, they will be remembered as martyrs.
Erebus walked. He was in no rush. Even as he heard the confused chatter from his vox feed, he just continued to walk down the war-torn street. The compliance had been going well. This world had little resistance to offer. It was almost overkill to send the entire Legion's strength down, but they had done it anyway, and here were the results. The cityscape was an absolute apocalypse. The city's defenders, if you could call them such, were armed with nothing more than the most simplistic of las rifles. They had barely even posed a speed bump to the Legiones Astartes of the Word-Bearers Legion. But then had come the plea for help from Kerr, and Erebus knew that at long last, after decades, his time had come. His helm was mag-locked to his thigh, and as he walked he just simply surveyed the wreckage while thinking about the glories yet to come. The Dark Masters that he served, he could almost hear laughing. There was so much to do. Already a small portion of the Legion had been converted to the worship of the Great Powers. Not a significant portion by any metric, but just enough so when the time came, he would be ready with disciples to carry forth the message of the gods. He had been waiting for a sign. He had been waiting for a sign for decades now. A sign that would mean the time was approaching. The time where he would stop hiding in the shadows and bring forth his true intentions to light. Of course, some of his intentions would remain secret, but that was just the nature of what he was. As he walked, he took a few moments to simply gloat to himself about the state of the Legion, about the state of the Imperium, and about what was about to transpire. Granted, he didn't know what was happening on Kerr, but he had a relatively good idea. The slow pace of the Word-Bearers had finally garnered all the wrong kinds of attention, and soon they would be held to account. And on that day, he would be ready, and that day was soon to come. In his ear, his vox feed rang with the sound of sergeants and captains shouting, urging their men to board the dropships and Thunderhawks, urging their men to get back to the ships in orbit. He could only imagine what was going through the minds of the defenders of this world right now, having seen their enemies who had been destroying them so utterly, fleeing away into the night sky. He took a moment to pause as he walked through the shattered remnants of what was a capital city of one of this world's pitiful nation-states. Had the Word-Bearers allowed to be continued, eventually statues would have been erected, churches would have been raised, and voices would have been taught to raise praise to the false emperor of mankind. Lorgar's father, the man that Erebus himself claimed to worship as a god. He almost laughed at the mere irony of that now. Erebus filled his lungs with the scent of a dead city, smoke, ash, and the scent of decay wafting into his nostrils. He closed his eyes to savor the moment he had felt coming for decades, that he had been promised by his Dark Masters. And slowly he turned around, ready to walk back to his own waiting Thunderhawk. It was then that he started to feel it, a strange sensation. A strange sensation in the pit of his gut, something that he hadn't felt before, not since... He slowly looked around, pulling his bolter from his side, scanning the wreckage and the rubble of the city in the distance. He simply couldn't put his finger on it. In his chest, against his will, his second heart started beating in rhythm with his first. The feeling simply grew, beating against his chest now in rhythm with his heart's. Something was wrong here. His hand snapped down to his side, grabbing a hold of his helmet for the first time since he had made planetfall. Just as he was about to slide his helm over his head, he heard it. Soft, rhythmic. breathing. The feeling of pure unease was just rolling through him now like a tide, and slowly he looked nearby his feet, and that's when he saw it. It was a human, a young boy, probably 8, 9 years old. As he looked down at the child, his lip curled in a sneer. There were words for what this child was. Untouchables, pariahs, black souls, nulls, but they were most commonly known as blanks. The child was emaciated. It had probably been abandoned by his mother at some point in its youth. And as Erebus looked on it, he raised his bolter to put the thing out of its misery, and he felt no pity. But then he smiled. Slowly he reached up to his neck and pressed the button on his collar that would disable his Vox link. The child simply stared up at him, green eyes echoing out from a blonde mop of dirty hair.
Can you understand me, boy?
Erebus placed his bolter back at his side, and slowly he went down to one knee beside the youth. The boy's head simply nodded in understanding, and Erebus continued.
Look up.
Erebus said, turning his own head to look at the stars above, as well as engine flares from hundreds of Thunderhawks and dropships that were now leaving the planet's surface.
Amazing, aren't they?
His eyes turned back down to the youth, who didn't seem to have looked away from him.
At some point, you might have traveled among them. You might have reached out to try and touch them. You might have looked for answers in the depths of those stars. And you might have even found them. But no. Unfortunately, you had to run afoul of us. Those of us who serve the Emperor of Mankind.
He reached out and ruffled the child's hair.
Can you imagine the hubris in that? To simply refer to yourself as the Emperor. To command power beyond reason. To try to command the very power of the gods themselves. It's no wonder my gene father considers him a god.
Once more, Erebus' lip turned in pure scorn.
Can you imagine worshipping something like that? It simply makes my skin crawl.
Erebus folded his hands on his knee, staring down at the youth.
But not for much longer, my child. No man can challenge the power of the gods uncontested. But this emperor decided to do just that.
The boy's eyes were completely locked on Erebus. Not a single word passing his lips as Erebus continued to speak.
This god my father worships, he doesn't even see this coming. And I have been the one to bring it about.
Erebus found that he was enjoying this conversation. Despite the almost overwhelming sense of unease that seemed to radiate from the child, he was actually smiling. His hand reached down to his side, drawing his combat knife.
Yes, it was me. It's always been me. I am the instrument of the gods. No matter what happens after today, it's going to be because of me. I am going to be the one who brings an end to this Emperor of Mankind, and I will usher in a new age of chaos the likes of which the galaxy has never seen. Come on, laugh, boy. Laugh. Enjoy your lot in life.
His hand snapped down, grabbing hold of the child's neck.
You are to be the first, but not the last. Enjoy your place, child. Enjoy your privilege to be sacrificed to the gods.
Erebus turned his head to the sky and started laughing. And then he heard it. The boy was laughing too. Erebus started to pull the child up from the ground, looking down at him. And that's when he heard the other noise. A soft vibration. A vibration that was pulsing, getting faster and faster. The only reason he hadn't heard it in the first place because the boy had been laying on top of whatever was making the noise. He reached down, grabbing the child and throwing it to the side, not even looking to where the boy landed.
No.
Buried underneath rubble that would now only serve as shrapnel were 3 demolition charges. The bulk of the charges were hidden underneath the rubble of the city, but the boy had been laying on a pressure switch, and that pressure switch had now been disengaged by Erebus's own hand. The first chaplain of the Word-Bearer stared down at enough explosives to level a half-block, and there was nowhere for him to go, no cover to dive to, nothing he could hide under, and no matter how fast he ran, he would never escape it. As he watched the timer go from 4 seconds to 3 seconds, he looked up dumbly at the child, whose grin stretched now from ear to ear. Erebus slowly looked ahead of himself, his jaw open in slack amazement and disbelief.
How?
Finally the boy spoke, and the words were the last thing that Erebus would ever hear.
For the powers.
As the Word-Bearer's fleet entered the warp, they started counting the casualties of their last compliance. 10 deaths overall in the entirety of the Legion. The final entry was for First Chaplain Erebus. First Chaplain Erebus, killed by improvised explosive device while withdrawing from planet. Gene seed destroyed.